The coffee was still warm when they found it. That detail haunted Detective Sarah Chun for months afterward. Not the abandoned car, not the half-packed suitcase thrown carelessly across the back seat, not even the unopened safe lock, still wrapped in its plastic packaging. It was that styrofoam cup sitting on the dashboard of Daniel Harper's Honda Accord, steam rising lazily in the October morning air, that made her blood run cold. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and the time, because it's always powerful to see how far these stories travel. Someone had been in that car less than 10 minutes before the railroad maintenance. Crew discovered it tucked behind the old freight building at Milford Station. The coffee receipt crumpled on the passenger floor was time-stamped 6:47 a.m. from Murphy's Gas and Go. Just 12 miles down Highway 9, by 7:15 a.m., Daniel Harper had vanished from the face of the earth. 19 days earlier, Daniel had been the luckiest man in Ohio. The numbers 714-212-83542 had transformed him from a 34-year-old insurance adjuster living paycheck to paycheck into a multimillionaire overnight. $42 million. After taxes, Daniel Harper walked away with enough money to never work another day in his life. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that he'd only had 19 days to enjoy it. But let's start at the beginning. Because in mysteries like this, the beginning is never really the beginning. The real story starts 3 months before Daniel bought that winning ticket at Chun's Corner Market on Elm Street. It starts with a phone call that nobody remembers him receiving, and a conversation that would later prove to be the thread that unraveled everything. Milford, Ohio, population 8,847, isn't the kind of place where people disappear. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where Mrs. Patterson still leaves her front door unlocked, and where the biggest scandal in recent memory was when the high school principal was caught embezzling lunch money. When Daniel Harper won the lottery, the whole town celebrated. When he vanished, the whole town wondered if they'd ever really known him at all. Daniel had lived on Maple Street his entire life, in the same house where his grandmother had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. He was quiet, reliable, the kind of man who showed up early to work and stayed late when needed. He volunteered at the food bank every third Saturday and had been dating Sarah Mitchell, the librarian, for 2 years. Nothing about Daniel Harper suggested he was the type of man who would disappear in the night, leaving behind a fortune and a life that finally seemed to be going his way. Which is why Detective Chun knew from the moment she saw that warm coffee cup that something was very, very wrong. The first 48 hours of any missing person case are critical. But Daniel's case was different from the start. He wasn't just missing. He was missing with $42 million. The FBI was called in by day 2, and suddenly, Milford was crawling with agents in dark suits, asking questions nobody knew how to answer. The timeline, as investigators would later reconstruct it, was maddeningly precise right up until it wasn't. Daniel had dinner with Sarah Mitchell on Sunday, October 15th, at Romano's Italian restaurant. They split the check, as they always did, and Daniel walked her home, kissing her goodnight on her front porch at 9:43 p.m. Sarah remembered the time exactly because she'd glanced at her watch, thinking about the book club meeting she had to prepare for the next morning. Daniel's neighbor, Frank Kowalski, saw him pull into his driveway at 9:51 p.m. Frank was very precise about times, a habit from his 30 years working at the railroad. He was outside checking his mailbox, something he did every night before bed when Daniel's Honda pulled up. They waved to each other, Frank called out something about the weather turning cold, and Daniel nodded before heading inside. That was the last confirmed sighting of Daniel Harper alive. The next morning, Monday, October 16th, Daniel didn't show up for work at Midwest Insurance. His supervisor, Janet Reeves, called his house at 9:15 a.m. when he missed the morning staff meeting. No answer. She tried his cell phone. Straight to voicemail. By noon, she was worried enough to drive by his house. Daniel's car was gone, but that wasn't unusual. Sometimes he had to drive out to accident sites for investigations. What was unusual was that his front door was standing wide open, and the morning newspaper was still sitting on his porch. Janet didn't go inside. Something about that open door, yawning like a mouth in the middle of the day, made her skin crawl. She called the police from her car, parked in Daniel's driveway with her engine running and her doors locked. Officer Mike Rodriguez was the first to respond. He'd known Daniel since they were kids. They'd played Little League together, gone to the same high school. When he stepped through that open front door and called Daniel's name into the echoing silence, Mike said later that he knew immediately something was wrong. Not just wrong, catastrophically wrong. The house looked like Daniel had left in a hurry. His bed wasn't made, which wasn't like him. Sarah Mitchell would later confirm that Daniel was meticulous about making his bed every morning, a habit ingrained by his grandmother. The coffee pot was still on. The coffee burned to sludge. His wallet was gone, but his spare keys were still on the kitchen counter. His toothbrush was missing from the bathroom, but his razor was still there. Most telling of all, the suitcase that usually lived on the top shelf of his bedroom closet was gone. It wasn't until Tuesday afternoon that the railroad crew found Daniel's car. The discovery came almost by accident. Joe Martinez and his partner were checking the drainage around the old freight building when Joe spotted something that didn't belong. The building had been abandoned for 15 years, since the railroad company had moved their operations to a newer facility on the other side of town. Nothing should have been parked back there, except maybe teenagers looking for a place to cause trouble. But there was Daniel's Honda, tucked neatly between two rusted-out freight containers, like someone had been trying to hide it. The car doors were unlocked. The keys were gone. And that suitcase, the one missing from Daniel's closet, was thrown across the back seat, like someone had tossed it there in a hurry. Detective Chun arrived within minutes of Joe's call. She was 36, had been with Milford PD for 8 years, and had worked exactly 3 missing person cases that didn't resolve themselves within 24 hours. But the moment she saw that scene, she knew this was different. The suitcase was half-packed with men's clothing, 2 shirts, a pair of jeans, some underwear, and socks. Nothing that suggested a long trip or a permanent departure. Stuffed into one corner was a manila envelope containing exactly $5,000 in cash, mostly 20s and 50s. Not the kind of money someone planning to disappear forever would leave behind, but it was the safe lock that really caught her attention. The lock was still in its plastic packaging, the price tag from Murphy's Hardware still attached. It was a small combination lock, the kind you might use for a gym locker or a toolbox. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. But why would someone buy a safe lock and then leave it unopened in their abandoned car? The receipt from Murphy's Gas and Go told another story. Coffee, black. A package of peanut butter crackers. Total, $3.47, paid in cash. Time, 6:47 a.m. The time stamp placed Daniel just 12 miles from where his car was found. Less than 30 minutes before the railroad crew arrived for their morning shift, Detective Chun bagged everything, called in the crime scene technicians, and tried not to think about that warm coffee cup. But the question nagged at her. If Daniel had bought coffee at 6:47 a.m., where had he been between Sunday night and Monday morning? And why had he driven to an abandoned train station to drink it? The phone records arrived on Wednesday, and that's when the case took its first sharp turn into genuinely weird territory. Daniel had made exactly one phone call after his dinner with Sarah on Sunday night. At 11:23 p.m., he'd called a number that traced back to a prepaid cell phone purchased with cash from a convenience store in Columbus. The call had lasted 3 minutes and 17 seconds. The FBI's tech team managed to recover fragments of the conversation from Daniel's carrier, but only one line came through clearly. Daniel's voice, tense and urgent. If it doesn't work, burn the list in the safe. If it doesn't work, burn the list in the safe. The phrase became the obsession of everyone working the case. What list? What safe? And what exactly wasn't supposed to work? Special Agent Emma Torres, the FBI's lead investigator, had Daniel's house torn apart looking for any kind of safe or list. They found nothing. She had his bank records scrutinized line by line. Daniel had deposited his lottery winnings in 3 separate accounts, but he hadn't touched the money. Not a penny. For a man who had allegedly fled with his fortune, he'd been remarkably careful not to access it. The investigation expanded. Daniel's co-workers were interviewed. His friends, his acquaintances, his auto mechanic, his dentist. Everyone painted the same picture. Daniel Harper was a good man, a quiet man, a man with no enemies and no secrets. But everyone was wrong about the secret's dot. It was Sarah Mitchell who found the first real clue. And she found it by accident, 3 weeks after Daniel's disappearance. Sarah was trying to return to some kind of normal routine. She'd been staying with her sister since Daniel vanished, unable to bear the thought of being alone in her house, but she needed to get back to work. The library board had been patient, but Milford's library couldn't run itself. She was reshelving returned books when she opened a copy of The Complete Works of Edgar Allan Poe and found a folded piece of paper tucked between the pages. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, the kind Daniel used for handwritten thank-you notes. The handwriting was definitely his. She'd seen it on dozens of birthday cards and love notes over their 2 years together. The paper contained a list of 3 names. Marcus Chun, Elena Vasquez, William Cross below the names. In Daniel's careful script was an address, 4847 Industrial Boulevard, Columbus, Ohio, and below that, a single word, Tuesday. Sarah stared at the paper for a long time before she called Detective Chun. She recognized 2 of the names, and that recognition made her hands shake as she dialed. Marcus Chun had been Daniel's best friend in high school. They'd been inseparable until Marcus died in a motorcycle accident 3 weeks before graduation. Sarah remembered Daniel talking about him, about how guilty he felt that he hadn't been there when it happened, how he still missed him 15 years later. Elena Vasquez was a name from even further back. She'd been a girl Daniel had known in middle school, a shy kid with dark hair who'd moved away when they were 14. Sarah only knew about her because Daniel had mentioned her once, wondering whatever happened to her. A casual internet search had turned up an obituary from 2018. Elena had died in a house fire in Tampa, Florida. 2 of the 3 names belonged to people who were dead. So who was William Cross? Detective Chun ran the name through every database she could access. William Cross was surprisingly common. There were 47 men by that name in Ohio alone, but none of them seemed to have any connection to Daniel Harper. She cross-referenced the Industrial Boulevard address and found it belonged to a commercial storage facility called Secure Space Storage. The facility had been closed for renovation since August. The manager hadn't seen any customers in weeks. Agent Torres took over the storage facility angle, and what she found there made the case even stranger. Unit 247 had been rented 3 months earlier by someone using the name Marcus Chun. The rental agreement was signed in cash, but the signature didn't match any known samples of Marcus Chun's handwriting from his school records, because, of course, Marcus Chun had been dead for 15 years. The unit was empty when the FBI opened it, but the forensic team found traces of recent activity. Footprints in the dust suggested someone had been there within the last week. There were drag marks across the floor, as if something heavy had been moved. And on the back wall, someone had scratched a series of numbers into the concrete. 714212835542. Daniels. Winning lottery numbers. The investigation was spiraling into territory that none of the investigators wanted to acknowledge. Dead men don't rent storage units. Dead men don't leave lists in library books. And dead men certainly don't scratch lottery numbers into concrete walls. But living men do all of those things if they're trying to send a message. Agent Torres began working a new theory. Daniel Harper hadn't been the victim of foul play or the perpetrator of an elaborate disappearance scheme. Daniel Harper had been trying to tell someone something, and he'd been using the names of dead people to do it. The question was who he'd been trying to tell, and why he'd chosen such a cryptic method of communication. The answer began to emerge from an unexpected source. Daniel's grandmother's effects. Daniel's house had been sealed as evidence, but his neighbors were getting restless. Frank Kowalski, the precise man who'd seen Daniel come home that last Sunday night, was particularly concerned about the property. He'd been picking up Daniel's mail, watering his plants, making sure everything looked normal from the outside. It was Frank who remembered that Daniel's grandmother had kept a storage unit of her own in the basement of the old Milford Community Center. When she died 5 years earlier, Daniel had cleaned out most of her belongings, but some items had been too emotionally difficult to deal with. He'd boxed them up and stored them, meaning to go through them someday when he felt ready. Detective Chun obtained a warrant for the storage space and found herself looking at 15 boxes of carefully preserved memories. Photo albums, letters, household items, and a trunk full of documents dating back to the 1940s. It was in the trunk that she found Daniel's grandmother's diary. The diary covered the years 1963 to 1987, written in the same careful handwriting that Daniel had inherited. Most entries were mundane grocery lists, weather observations, notes about neighbors and friends. But scattered throughout were references to something she called the group. March 15, 1974. The group met again today. Robert is getting nervous about the whole thing, but Marcus says we're too close to stop now. June 3, 1976. Elena called. She's worried that someone at the newspaper is asking questions. We may need to move the timeline up. October 12, 1981. William thinks we should tell the children when they're older. I'm not so sure. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. And then, the entry that made Detective Chun's blood run cold. December 23, 1987. Daniel's getting old, enough to ask questions about his parents' accident. I pray he never learns the truth about what really happened that night. What we did was necessary, but he could never understand. The list is hidden where he'll find it someday, if something happens to me. Let God forgive us all. Daniel's parents hadn't died in a random car accident. They'd been killed, and Daniel's grandmother had been involved. The realization sent the investigation in a completely new direction. Agent Torres started digging into the details of the car crash that had orphaned Daniel. The accident report from 1999 was routine icy roads, a sharp curve, a tragic but unremarkable collision with a tree. But the insurance investigation from the time had raised some questions. Daniel's father had been a journalist for the Columbus Dispatch, working primarily on local crime stories. In the months before his death, he'd been investigating a series of unsolved disappearances from the 1970s. Young people, mostly college students, who'd vanished without a trace. The police had assumed they were runaways or victims of random crime. But Daniel's father had noticed patterns. All of the missing people had been involved in some kind of activism, anti-war protests, civil rights demonstrations, environmental causes. All of them had been reported missing within a 50-mile radius of Milford, and all of them had last been seen in the company of helpful strangers who'd offered them rides or assistance. Daniel's father had been close to identifying a network of people responsible for the disappearances when his car had slid off that icy road. The story was starting to come together, but the picture it painted was darker than anyone had imagined. Daniel's grandmother had been part of a group that had been making activists disappear in the 1970s and early 1980s. They'd killed Daniel's father when he'd gotten too close to the truth. And somehow, Daniel had figured it out. But how had he known? And what had he planned to do with the information? The answer came from an unexpected source. The Milford Public Library's computer records. Sarah Mitchell, despite being emotionally devastated by Daniel's disappearance, was still the best librarian in 3 counties. When Agent Torres asked if she could trace Daniel's research activity in the weeks before his disappearance, Sarah knew exactly where to look. The library's computer system logged every search, every database access, every document printed or emailed. In the month before he'd vanished, Daniel had been doing extensive research into missing persons cases from the 1970s. He'd requested archived newspaper articles, court records, police reports. He'd been trying to piece together the same story his father had died investigating. But Daniel had gone further than his father ever had. He'd found the connection between the disappearances and a specific group of Milford residents. He'd identified the members of his grandmother's group. Marcus Chun hadn't just been Daniel's best friend. He'd been the son of Robert Chun, one of the group's leaders. Elena Vasquez had been the daughter of Maria Vasquez, another member. Both Marcus and Elena had died under circumstances that seemed suspicious when viewed through the lens of what Daniel had discovered. William Cross was the one living member left. Agent Torres ran a background check on every William Cross in Ohio and found him in the 3rd search. William Anthony Cross, age 74, resident of Columbus, Ohio, retired postal worker. No criminal record. No known connection to Milford, Ohio, except that 47 years earlier, he'd been William Anthony Kowalski, and he'd been Frank Kowalski's older brother, Frank Kowalski, Daniel's neighbor. Frank Kowalski, who'd been so helpful during the investigation. Frank Kowalski, who'd been the last person to see Daniel alive. Frank Kowalski, who'd changed his name to William Cross in 1981 and moved to Columbus, leaving his younger brother behind in Milford to keep watch over the families of their victims. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Daniel hadn't just discovered his grandmother's secret. He'd realized that the people responsible for his parents' death were still alive, still in Milford, still watching him. And on that Sunday night, after dinner with Sarah, after 2 years of careful research and planning, Daniel had made his move, but what had his move been? Agent Torres and Detective Chun arrived at Frank Kowalski's house at dawn on Thursday, 3.5 weeks after Daniel's disappearance. They expected to find a frightened old man or an empty house. What they found instead was Frank sitting at his kitchen table, drinking coffee and reading the morning paper, as if he'd been waiting for them. "I wondered when you'd figure it out," he said without looking up from the sports section. Danny was always too smart for his own good, just like his father. Frank didn't resist arrest. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He seemed almost relieved as Detective Chun read him his rights, but he wouldn't say what had happened to Daniel. "The boy made his choice," Frank said as they loaded him into the patrol car. "Same choice his father made. Some people just can't leave well enough alone." The interrogation lasted 6 hours and yielded nothing useful. Frank admitted to being part of the group that had killed activists in the 1970s. He admitted to murdering Daniel's parents when they'd gotten too close to the truth. But when it came to Daniel's fate, he simply smiled and said, "Ask him yourself when you find him." The search for Daniel intensified. If Frank had killed him, there had to be evidence. A body, blood evidence, something to prove what had happened that Sunday night after Daniel had arrived home. It was Agent Torres who realized they'd been looking in the wrong place. Daniel's car had been found at the old train station, but the station wasn't random. It was directly across the tracks from the old Milford Cemetery, where Daniel's parents were buried, where his grandmother was buried, where Marcus Chun and Elena Vasquez were also buried, along with dozens of other people whose deaths might not have been as natural as they'd appeared. The cemetery records went back to 1887, and they told the story of a community that had experienced an unusual number of sudden deaths over the years. Young people with heart attacks, accidents that seemed too convenient, disappearances that had eventually been classified as deaths when no other explanation could be found. But it wasn't the cemetery itself that held the answer. It was what lay beneath it. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a network of tunnels under the old section of the cemetery, tunnels that connected to the basement of the abandoned train station. The tunnels were old, probably built during Prohibition as part of a bootlegging operation, but they'd been maintained much more recently, and they led to an underground chamber that had been modified into a makeshift prison. The chamber contained evidence of recent habitation: food wrappers, water bottles, a sleeping bag, but no sign of Daniel Harper. However, carved into one of the stone walls, in letters that matched Daniel's handwriting, was a message: "They think they won, but the list is safe. Look for the lottery numbers." The list. The same list Daniel had mentioned in his phone call. The list he'd told someone to burn if things didn't work out. But Daniel hadn't hidden the list in a safe. He'd hidden it in the safest place he could think of with Sarah Mitchell, in a book in the library where she worked. The book where she'd found those 3 names. The investigators had been thinking too literally. When Daniel had said, "Burn the list in the safe," he hadn't been talking about a physical safe. He'd been talking about the safe haven where he'd hidden his real evidence. Sarah found the rest of the list exactly where Daniel had left it, tucked inside a first edition of The Adventure of the Empty House. The choice of book was deliberate, was a Sherlock Holmes story about someone who appeared to be dead but was actually in hiding. The complete list contained 47 names: dead activists, missing persons, and the members of the group responsible for their murders. It was accompanied by copies of documents, photographs, and a detailed timeline that proved the existence of a murder conspiracy spanning decades. But at the bottom of the list, In Daniel's handwriting was a note that changed everything. If you're reading this, it means my plan worked. I'm not dead, I'm in hiding until it's safe to come forward. The winning lottery ticket was the key to everything. They could never let me disappear with that much money without investigating why. I knew they'd find the evidence if I made my disappearance mysterious enough. Frank confessed, didn't he? Tell Sarah, I'm sorry, but this was the only way to get justice for everyone they killed. I'll come home when it's safe. Check the lottery numbers one more time. Agent Torres stared at the note for a long time before she understood what Daniel meant about the lottery numbers. She'd been thinking of them as random digits. But what if they weren't random at all? 7-14-21-28-35-42.7, 1421. The pattern was simple once you saw it. Each number was 7 more than the previous one. It wasn't a random lottery win. Daniel had been playing those specific numbers for months, waiting for them to come up, knowing that a massive lottery win would make his disappearance into a federal case. Daniel, Harper had orchestrated his own vanishing act, knowing that the investigation into his disappearance would uncover the truth about his family's murder and bring down the conspiracy that had been operating in Milford for decades. He'd sacrificed his relationship, his home, his entire life to get justice for people who'd been dead for 40 years. But where was he now? The final clue came from an unlikely source. The unopened safe lock found in Daniel's abandoned car. Agent Torres had the lock examined by the FBI's technical team. Not because she expected to find fingerprints or DNA, but because something about it bothered her. Why buy a lock and leave it unopened? Why make sure it was found with the rest of the evidence? The answer was in the product information. The lock was a Master Lock Model 175, a combination lock with a default setting of 000, but more importantly, it was the type of lock used by Secure Space Storage. For their rental units. Daniel had bought the lock as a replacement for the one on Storage Unit 247, the unit rented by the fictional Marcus Chun. He'd been planning to access the unit, but he'd needed to replace the lock afterward to avoid suspicion. Agent Torres returned to the storage facility with a warrant and the combination that had been scratched on the concrete wall. 71421283542. The lock opened easily when she input the lottery numbers. Inside Unit 247. She found $50,000 in cash, a fake passport in the name of William Marcus Cross, and a bus ticket to Seattle dated October 16th, the day after Daniel's disappearance. But she also found something else, a video camera. Still recording, the camera had been set up to monitor the storage unit, waiting for someone to open it. When Agent Torres triggered the motion sensor, the camera stopped recording and began playing back the footage it had captured. The video showed Daniel Harper entering the storage unit at 4:23 a.m. on Monday, October 16th. He was carrying a duffel bag and moving quickly, but he didn't look afraid. He looked determined. Daniel faced the camera directly, as if he'd known it was there, and spoke clearly. If you're watching this, it means you found everything. Frank and his friends killed my parents, my grandmother's friends, and God knows how many other people over the years. They thought they could get away with it because they were patient, because they were careful, because they waited long enough for people to forget. But I didn't forget. I spent 2 years planning this, making sure that when I disappeared, you'd have to investigate. I knew Frank wouldn't be able to resist keeping tabs on the case. He's been watching me my whole life. making sure I never got too curious about my parents' accident. The lottery win was the perfect trigger. $42 million is enough money to make anyone suspicious when the winner vanishes. I knew you'd have to bring in federal agents. Knew you'd have to dig deeper than the Milford police ever could. I'm sorry I had to lie to Sarah. Sorry I had to hurt people who cared about me. But this was the only way to make sure Frank and William Cross couldn't hurt anyone else. By the time you see this, I'll be long gone. The passport is fake. The bus ticket is misdirection. I'm not going to Seattle, and I'm not coming back to Milford. There are still people out there who might come looking for me. People who were part of this, but were smart enough to distance themselves when things got dangerous. Tell Sarah I love her, and I'll find a way to contact her when it's safe. Tell her the engagement ring is in our favorite book. She'll know the one. And tell Detective Chun that the coffee was a message. If she's half as smart as she seems, she'll figure out what it means. The video ended, and Agent Torres was left staring at an empty storage unit. Wondering what Daniel Harper meant about the coffee dot, it took Detective Chun 3 days to work it out. The coffee receipt from Murphy's Gas and Go. Time-stamped 6:47 a.m. Coffee, black. Peanut butter crackers. Paid in cash. Detective Chun drove to Murphy's Gas and Go and talked to the morning clerk, a teenager named Jason, who worked the 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. shift. Jason remembered the sale because it had been unusual. Most of their morning customers paid with cards, and most of them bought more than just coffee and crackers. But what Jason remembered most clearly was that the customer had asked for a pen to write something down. Jason had handed over a ballpoint pen from behind the counter, and the man had written on a napkin before leaving the pen on the counter and walking out. The napkin was long gone. But Jason remembered thinking it was weird that someone would buy coffee just to write a note. Detective Chun realized that Daniel hadn't bought the coffee to drink it. He'd bought the coffee to establish a time stamp and location, and he'd used the gas station stop to leave one final message. But the message hadn't been on a napkin. It had been something he could be sure would be preserved. She checked with Murphy's security system and found that they kept their video surveillance for 90 days. The footage from October 16th showed Daniel Harper at 6:47 a.m., just as the receipt indicated. But it also showed him doing something unexpected. After paying for his coffee and crackers, Daniel had walked to the payphone in the corner of the store, an old-fashioned phone booth that Murphy's had kept as a nostalgic decoration. He'd made a phone call that lasted exactly 1 minute. The phone company still had records of calls made from that number. At 6:48 a.m. on October 16th, someone had called the tip line for America's Most Wanted. Detective Chun contacted the show's producers and learned that they'd received an anonymous tip about the location of evidence in a decades-old murder case. The caller had provided specific information about where to find documents related to the disappearances of several young activists in Ohio during the 1970s. The tip had been forwarded to the FBI, but it had gotten lost in bureaucratic shuffle. By the time anyone thought to follow up on it, Daniel Harper had been missing for a week. Daniel had made sure his story would be told, even if he couldn't tell it himself. Frank Kowalski was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life in prison. William Cross, a.k.a. William Anthony Kowalski, died of a heart attack 2 days after Frank's arrest, taking whatever remaining secrets he knew to his grave. The investigation into the decades-old conspiracy resulted in the exhumation of 17 bodies from Milford Cemetery. Forensic evidence confirmed that at least 11 of them had been murder victims, not the accident victims or natural deaths that had been recorded on their death certificates. Sarah, Mitchell found the engagement ring exactly where Daniel had said it would be inside their favorite book, a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice that they'd read together during their first year of dating. Along with the ring was a letter explaining everything Daniel couldn't say in his video message, and a phone number where she could reach him in 6 months, when he was sure it was safe. But 6 months came and went, and when Sarah called the number, it had been disconnected. Daniel Harper had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. No William Marcus Cross ever used the fake passport found in the storage unit. No one matching Daniel's description was ever spotted in Seattle or anywhere else. The $50,000 in cash disappeared from evidence storage under circumstances that remain unexplained. Detective Chun retired from the Milford Police Department 6 months after Frank Kowalski's conviction. She moved to Portland, Oregon, where she now works as a private investigator specializing in cold cases. She's never forgotten Daniel Harper's case, and she's never stopped wondering if he's still out there somewhere, living under a new name, starting a new life. On the anniversary of Daniel's disappearance, she receives an anonymous postcard. No message, just a picture of a lighthouse on the coast of Maine. The postmark is always different, sometimes California, sometimes Florida, sometimes places she's never heard of. Detective Chun doesn't know if the postcards are from Daniel Harper. She's never tried to trace them, never tried to investigate their origin. Some mysteries, she's learned, are meant to stay unsolved. Sarah Mitchell still works at the Milford Public Library. She never married, though she's had opportunities. Every few months, someone returns a book with a slip of paper tucked inside, not a message, just a lottery ticket with the numbers 714-212-83542. Sarah keeps the tickets in a shoebox in her closet, next to the engagement ring she's never worn. She's never played the lottery, but she still checks those numbers every week. They've never come up again. The old train station in Milford was demolished 2 years after Daniel's disappearance. The city built a small park in its place, with a memorial garden for the victims of the conspiracy that had operated in their town for so many decades. Daniel Harper's name isn't on the memorial, because officially, he's still just a missing person. But sometimes, late at night, when the library is closed and Sarah is walking home, she sees a figure standing by the memorial garden. The figure is always gone by the time she gets close enough to see clearly, but she likes to think it might be Daniel, checking to make sure the people he saved are remembered. The truth about Daniel Harper's disappearance may never be known. Did he stage his own vanishing to expose a decades-old conspiracy? Is he still alive somewhere, living under an assumed identity, forever looking over his shoulder? Or did Frank Kowalski and his accomplices manage to silence him permanently, despite all of Daniel's careful planning? The evidence supports any of these theories. Daniel was smart enough to disappear completely if he wanted to. He was also naive enough to underestimate how dangerous his enemies might be. And Frank Kowalski was certainly clever enough to make a murder look like an elaborate disappearance scheme. What we know for certain is that Daniel Harper's lottery win was the key that unlocked a mystery that had been buried for 40 years. Whether he intended it as his masterstroke or his final gamble, it worked. Justice was served, even if Daniel himself was never seen again. The warm coffee cup found on the dashboard of his abandoned car has become something of a legend in Milford. Some people say it proves Daniel is still alive, that he left it there as a sign that he'd made his escape. Others believe it was left there by Frank Kowalski, a taunt for the investigators who would never be able to prove what really happened that October morning. Detective Chun has her own theory, but she's never shared it with anyone. She thinks the coffee cup was Daniel's way of saying goodbye, a final gesture from a man who knew he was walking into a situation he might not survive, but who wanted to leave behind one last puzzle for someone smart enough to solve it. The coffee was still warm when they found it. In the end, that might be the only truth we'll ever know about what happened to Daniel Harper in those final moments before he vanished from the world. Whether he escaped or was silenced, whether he's living free under a new identity or lying dead in an unmarked grave, the mystery of his disappearance continues to haunt everyone who knew him. But there was one more piece of evidence that came to light 3 years later, a piece that cast everything in a different light, or perhaps made the mystery even deeper. A construction crew renovating the basement of the Milford Community Center found something unexpected behind a false wall that had been installed sometime in the 1980s. It was a safety deposit box, small and fireproof, containing a collection of documents that had belonged to Daniel's grandmother. The documents included detailed records of the conspiracy's activities, complete with dates, names, and locations of burial sites. But they also contained something else, a letter addressed to Daniel, dated just 2 weeks before his grandmother's death in 2018. The letter read, "My dearest Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've discovered the truth about what we did. I know you'll hate me for it, but I need you to understand that we thought we were protecting this town from people who wanted to destroy everything we built. We were wrong, but by the time we realized it, we were in too deep to stop. Your parents found out about us, and we had to silence them. It's the thing I regret most in this world, taking you away from the 2 people who loved you most. But Frank convinced us it was necessary, and we were all so afraid of going to prison, of losing everything. I've left evidence of everything we did hidden, where you'll find it when you're ready. When you do find it, you'll have a choice to make. You can turn us in and destroy what's left of our families, or you can let sleeping dogs lie and try to move on with your life. I hope you choose to let it go. Danny, I hope you can be the bigger person that none of us managed to be. But I know you, and I know you won't be able to live with the knowledge of what we did. You're too much like your father. If you decide to pursue justice, be careful. Frank is still alive, and he's never forgotten how to make people disappear. Don't trust anyone in Milford. The conspiracy went deeper than you know. There's money hidden in the same place as these documents. Enough to start a new life somewhere far from here, if that's what you choose. Sometimes running away is the bravest thing you can do. I love you more than you'll ever know, and I'm sorry for the burden I'm leaving you with. Whatever you decide to do, know that I'll understand. Your loving grandmother, Margaret Harper. P.S. The winning lottery numbers are hidden in plain sight. Look for the pattern in the dates of the disappearances. The construction crew turned the letter over to Detective Chun, who had maintained her interest in the case despite her retirement. She spent weeks analyzing the dates of the disappearances that Daniel's research had uncovered, and eventually found the pattern that Daniel had seen. The dates, when converted to numbers, contained sequences that added up to 7, 14, 21, 28, 35, and 42. Daniel hadn't gotten lucky with the lottery. He'd known those numbers would eventually come up because someone was controlling the drawings. Someone with access to the lottery system had been ensuring that specific numbers would be drawn, probably as a way to fund the conspiracy's activities or to signal other members of the network. Daniel had figured out the pattern and waited for his numbers to come up, knowing that a massive lottery win would trigger the kind of investigation that would expose everything. But this revelation raised new questions. If Daniel had known the numbers were rigged, had he also known that winning would paint a target on his back? Had he planned his disappearance as an escape route, Or had he genuinely believed he could expose the conspiracy and live to see justice done? Detective Chun found herself pulled back into the case that had defined the last years of her career. She started digging into lottery records, looking for patterns in other drawings, other winners who might have been part of the network or its victims. What she found was disturbing. Over the past 20 years, there had been 17 lottery winners in Ohio who had died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances within a year of their win. Most had been ruled accidents or suicides, but when viewed as a pattern, they suggested something much more sinister. The lottery hadn't just been rigged to fund criminal activities. It had been used as a way to identify and eliminate people who got too close to the truth. Winners were approached by representatives of the conspiracy and given a choice: join the network or disappear. Most chose to join. Some chose to disappear on their own terms. Daniel Harper had chosen a third option: disappear in a way that would expose everyone. But Detective Chun's renewed investigation was cut short by a phone call that came in the middle of the night. 3 weeks after she'd started looking into the lottery connection, the voice was male, older, with a slight Midwest accent. Detective Chun? This is Daniel Harper. Chun sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. Daniel, is it really you? It's me. I've been following your investigation into the lottery connection. You're getting close to something that could get you killed, and I couldn't let that happen. Where are you? Are you safe? There was a long pause. I'm safe, but I can't tell you where I am. There are still people out there who want me dead. People who were part of the network, but smart enough to distance themselves when Frank got arrested. The postcards to Detective Chun, those aren't from me. Someone's been using my disappearance to cover their tracks, making it look like I'm still communicating so that people think I'm alive and hiding somewhere. It keeps the focus off the real perpetrators who are still out there. Detective Chun felt a chill run down her spine. Then who's been sending them? I don't know, but whoever it is has access to information about my case that was never made public. They know details that only someone involved in the original conspiracy would know. Daniel, you need to come forward. You need to testify. Frank is in prison, but there could be others. There are others. That's why I can't come back. Frank was just the muscle, Detective Chun. The real power behind the conspiracy is still out there, still active, still dangerous. My disappearance was supposed to end their operation, but it just drove them deeper underground. What about Sarah? She's been waiting for you for 3 years. Another long pause. I know. That's the hardest part of all this. But if I go back to her, I'll be putting her in danger. The people who killed my parents, who killed all those activists, they're still out there, and they know that the only person who can identify them is me. Then help us catch them. Give us names, locations, evidence. I've already given you everything I can. The storage unit, the video, the documents in my grandmother's things. It's all there. But the leaders of the conspiracy were never directly involved in the murders. They were careful to insulate themselves, to work through intermediaries like Frank and his brother. So what happens now? Now I stay dead, and you stay safe by dropping your investigation. The lottery connection leads to people with serious political power. Detective Chun, people who can make your retirement very unpleasant if you keep digging. I'm not afraid of them, Daniel. You should be. They've killed a lot of good people over the years. People who thought they could expose the truth and live to tell about it. The line went quiet for so long that Detective Chun thought Daniel had hung up. Daniel? Are you still there? I'm here. Look, there's something else you need to know. Something I couldn't put in the video or the documents because it would have put more people at risk. What is it? The conspiracy didn't end with the activists in the 1970s. It evolved. The people behind it realized that killing protesters and dissidents was too risky, too likely to attract attention. So they changed tactics. Changed how? They started targeting lottery winners, people who suddenly had enough money to be independent, to ask uncomfortable questions, to fund their own investigations. They'd approach recent winners and offer them a choice: join the network and help fund their activities, or have an accident. Detective Chun felt sick. How many people? I counted at least 50 suspicious deaths over the past 20 years. Maybe more. The lottery was the perfect cover. People expect winners to change their behavior, to move away, to become reclusive. When they disappeared or died, it didn't seem suspicious. And you figured this out before you won? I figured it out because I won. The lottery numbers weren't just rigged to fund the conspiracy. They were rigged to identify targets. My grandmother's letter mentioned that the winning numbers were hidden in the dates of the disappearances. I thought she meant the old disappearances from the 1970s, but she meant all of them. Every lottery winner who died or disappeared had won with numbers that corresponded to dates of significance to the conspiracy. The implications were staggering. The Ohio lottery had been compromised for decades, used as a tool to identify and eliminate people who might threaten the network's activities. Daniel, this is evidence of a criminal conspiracy that goes to the highest levels of state government. You have to come forward. No, I don't. Because the moment I surface, I'm dead. And so is anyone who tries to help me. This isn't just about a few old people in Milford who killed some activists in the 1970s. This is about a network of corruption that reaches into the state capitol, maybe even Washington. Then what's the solution? Do we just let them get away with it?
We already won, Detective Chen. Frank's confession broke open the original conspiracy. The families of the victims finally have answers. The people responsible for my parents' death are dead or in prison. That's enough. But what about all the lottery winners who died? What about the people who are still at risk? That's not my fight anymore. I gave up everything I cared about to expose what happened to my family. I can't save everyone. Detective Chen wanted to argue, wanted to convince Daniel to come forward and help them build a case against the larger network. But she could hear the exhaustion in his voice, the weight of 3 years spent looking over his shoulder, always wondering if today would be the day they found him. "Will I ever see you again?" she asked. "I don't know. Maybe someday, when I'm old and gray and the people hunting me are all dead. Maybe then I can come home. And Sarah? Tell her I think about her every day. Tell her she should move on, find someone who can give her the life she deserves. Tell her I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to find another way." The line went dead, leaving Detective Chen staring at her phone in the darkness of her Portland apartment. She never spoke to Daniel Harper again. 3 years later, Detective Chen received a package with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping from a small coastal town in Oregon, dated 6 months earlier. The headline read, "Local teacher dies in hiking accident." The article described how a 40-year-old elementary school teacher named David Hoffman had fallen from a cliff while hiking alone. His body had been recovered from the rocks below, and authorities had ruled the death accidental. The article included a photo of the victim, a bearded man with kind eyes who looked nothing like the Daniel Harper that Detective Chen remembered. But tucked behind the newspaper clipping was a handwritten note, "Some secrets die with the people who keep them. Thank you for understanding why this one had to die with me. D.H." Detective Chen kept the clipping and the note in a file folder marked, "Closed Cases," but she never reported the death to the FBI or anyone else involved in the original investigation. If Daniel Harper wanted to stay dead, she would respect his choice. Sarah Mitchell eventually did move on, though it took 5 more years. She married a librarian from Columbus whom she met at a regional conference, and they have 2 children together. She still works at the Milford Public Library, and she still keeps that shoebox full of lottery tickets with Daniel's numbers. Sometimes, when she's shelving books in the old section where she found Daniel's list, she wonders if there are more secrets hidden in those pages, more mysteries waiting to be discovered by someone brave enough or foolish enough to go looking for them. But she doesn't go looking anymore. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. The Daniel Harper case officially remains open, though no one has actively investigated it in years. Daniel's name is still in the missing persons database, and technically, he could still be alive somewhere, living under an assumed identity. But the people who knew him best have accepted that Daniel Harper died the night he disappeared, even if his body was never found. The man who made that phone call to Detective Chen, who sent those final clues about the lottery conspiracy, that wasn't Daniel Harper anymore. That was someone else, someone who had sacrificed everything Daniel had been in order to become something new. The abandoned lot where Daniel's car was found is now a small park with a walking trail that connects to the memorial garden built where the old train station used to stand. On quiet evenings, when the light is fading and the shadows are long, visitors sometimes report seeing a figure walking the trail alone. The figure never approaches anyone, never speaks, never stays long enough for anyone to get a clear look at his face. But those who've seen him say he moves like someone carrying a great weight, someone who's seen too much and lost too much and is still trying to find his way home. Whether that figure is Daniel Harper's ghost or Daniel Harper himself, no one can say. In a case filled with mysteries, it's just one more question that will probably never be answered. The coffee cup found on Daniel's dashboard was eventually destroyed, along with most of the other physical evidence from the case. But Detective Chen kept the receipt, that small slip of paper time-stamped 6:47 a.m., proof of Daniel's last known transaction with the world he was leaving behind. Sometimes she takes the receipt out of her files and stares at it, wondering what Daniel was thinking in those final moments before he walked away from everything he'd ever known. Was he afraid? Was he certain he was doing the right thing? Did he know he would never be coming back? The coffee was still warm when they found it. And in the end, that detail might be the most important clue of all, not because it tells us what happened to Daniel Harper, but because it tells us that whoever he became next, he's still out there somewhere, still warm, still alive in some form. Still carrying the weight of all the secrets he uncovered and all the truths he chose to take with him when he disappeared into the darkness of that October morning, leaving behind nothing but questions and a coffee cup that had grown cold by the time anyone thought to ask why it had been warm in the first place.